Good afternoon. This is another episode of the Gary Plock Tennis Show. And today it's going to be a little different because we do have a guest. This is my brother Ernie here with us, and we have a special
Hello,
guest,
folks.
Steve Berliner. And Steve was a champion tennis player and squash player, played both at the University of Pennsylvania, Penn, and actually played in the Maccabean Games several times in Israel and won gold medals each of those 7 times, both in squash and tennis, I believe. Steve, welcome to the show.
Great to be here, Gary and Ernie. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Steve.
What's really interesting is Steve's background, his family background, and that's going to be the focus of the show today. Steve's mother wrote a book, and here it is. It's called And the Month Was May by Lillian Berliner. And there's Lillian up there at the top with her parents. Now, what's very interesting is the fact that, unfortunately, the family were Hungarian Jews, if I'm correct about that, Steve.
Yes.
And lived up in the area that was later annexed, part of Transylvania. And anyway, eventually they were carted off to Auschwitz first. Steve, I'm going to let you take over from here.
Sure. Thank you for having me. So I'm just going to give a brief background of my mother's journey. I'm happy to also weave in my father because it is interrelated and interesting. So my mother's family, as you mentioned, lived in a small town on the Hungarian-Romanian border called Kolozsvár or Cluj. That was in Transylvania. The Nazis invaded Hungary in May of 1944, hence the name of the title, and the month was May. And they were sent to a converted brick factory.
Called the ghetto, is that right?
Right, yes. So they were in the ghetto for a couple of months. My grandfather was a highly decorated colonel in the Hungarian army in World War I. So his bonus was that he didn't have to wear a Jewish star in the ghetto like all the other Jewish detainees. So a couple of months later, in the middle of the night, they were forced onto a cattle car and sent God knows where. Ultimately, it turned out to be Auschwitz. They arrived in the middle of the night. It was a 3-day arduous trip where my grandfather got very ill because, again, if you've never seen a cable car, to all your listeners, I would encourage you to go see. They're quite small. I was on the board of the Museum of Jewish Heritage, the Living Memorial of the Holocaust. They had an incredible Auschwitz exhibit with a cattle car outside the museum. And I almost got physically ill when I saw how small it was because they crammed 100 people into these tiny cars. There were no windows. There was a pail in the middle of the car. When you had to go to the bathroom, the smell was horrific. My grandfather, who was in his 50s, got quite ill. And when they stopped and opened the door just to try to get some fresh air, he poked his head out, and one of the guards hit him in the face with the butt of his gun, broke his nose. So he was in a lot of pain when they arrived at Auschwitz. And when they arrived, they explained to them that there were 2 lines because it was about a half a mile walk from where the train stopped to the camp itself. And Ernie may have seen that. I've never been, so I don't know the actual dimensions of it. But my grandfather was too ill. He didn't feel he could walk a half a mile. So he wanted to go on the line where they said there were carriages that would take the old and infirmed Jews to the camp. And my mother and grandmother begged him not to do that. They'll all try and stay together. But he was too ill. He went on the carriages. Obviously, there were no carriages. They took them to the showers, saying you can't take you to the doctor smelling like this. And of course, the showers were the crematoriums. So my grandfather was immediately gassed upon arrival at Auschwitz.
Wow.
My mother and grandmother managed to stay together. My grandmother essentially fell apart emotionally, losing her beloved husband. My mother was an only child, and she was in her 40s already, and basically had sort of stopped caring about living. My mother, who was 17, but highly intelligent and a fighter, and she's 97 and she's still highly intelligent, still a fighter to this day, basically did the work for the two of them, because if you weren't able to do hard labor, clearing rubble from the roads after air raids, that sort of thing, they would kill you because there was no need to keep you alive. My mother recognized that there was no way they would survive Auschwitz, and because she was such a hard worker, and again in the context of my mother is 5 feet tall, and slight, she was able to get them transferred to a labor camp called Bremen. So after 3 months at Auschwitz, they were sent to Bremen, which was not a death camp, just a hard labor camp, but it was much more tolerable. And again, remember, when you were in a death camp, I mean, Ernie, I'm sure they showed videos of these things. It was like when I asked my mother after she saw Schindler's List. I said, Mom, what did you think about it? She said, well, it was amazingly well done, but it's hard to have truly emaciated actors who are starving. There's no way you can replicate the smell from the dead bodies that were everywhere at the crematoriums.
Well, Ernie was telling me, sorry to interrupt, Steve, but Ernie was telling me that he thought after reading your mother's account that one of the reasons that they did survive is because they got transferred to that labor camp rather than being right there in Auschwitz.
No question. But after 3 months at Bremen, as the Allied forces were making progress, they were put on one of the famous death marches that you've heard about, and there were about 2,000 women who had to march 50 or 60 miles in the dead of winter, and obviously no one had adequate clothing and shoes.
Wow.
2/3 of the women died on the march. Somehow my mother and grandmother survived, and that march took them to another death camp called Bergen-Belsen.
Amazing.
So they were in Bergen-Belsen for 6 months until the British Army liberated Bergen-Belsen on tax day, April 15, 1945. Again, Holocaust Remembrance Day, which we just had a couple of weeks ago, marks the liberation of Auschwitz, which was late January. So a lot of the other camps were liberated 1, 2, 3 months later, and obviously a lot of people died in those few months. Again, I can stop there, or I can. Again, I don't know if there are specific questions you want to ask. Well, I can talk about this. I've lectured many high schools on this.
Well, one thing, having read your mother's book, Steve, one thing that struck me was that the time during the war when she was transported to Auschwitz, I think I recall correct, was it May 1944, approximately?
And the month was May.
Yeah, in May, that's when they went to the ghetto. I believe it was in June of 44 that they were transported to Auschwitz.
So the ghetto was kind of like a processing center, wasn't it?
That's right. It was just a way to round up the Jews and put them in one central place. Transfer.
It struck me that here she was. It's such an incredible tale of survival, given that the summer of 1944, and she was in 2 concentration camps, not just one. That was actually the time when the Nazis were really ramping up the execution of Jews, because they had been able to invent the Cyclone B and they had a really a mass.
Explain the Cyclone B.
Well, believe it or not, I happened to explore this on a different path of inquiry when I was studying this German scientist named Fritz Haber, who was actually a Jew who converted to Lutheranism before the First World War. He was a close friend of Albert Einstein, and by the 1920s, he had developed Cyclone B, and it was employed by Hitler, of course, whereas half of the Jews were actually shot. I'm sure Steve is aware of this. But then once by 43, 44, the Cyclone B was being used.
Is that, in other words, that is a product, a chemical product for the gassing?
That's right. Just don't ask me what the molecular details are in its development, because I wouldn't be able to tell you. But the Nazis, by 44, of course, the war was turning against them. But the acceleration of the murder of Jews was ramping up more and more and more.
Oh, I see.
And, at that point, you ask the question, why were the Germans spending all that effort and that resources when they were fighting wars against the British and Americans in the West and the Soviets in the East, when they needed every soldier they needed to fight the war? But the way I look at that was that Nazi ideology was such, with the Jews responsible for everything and their racial bigotry. According to Goebbels, the Jews were in control of Downing Street in London. They were in control of the White House. They were especially in control of the Bolshevik fiefdom in Moscow. So in Hitler's, depraved mind, that was fighting the war, enhancing the extermination, and it's incredible, but that was the mindset.
Ernie, to your point, when the war started, people were being sent to the concentration camps initially. Obviously, you've read about how they would put numbers on people's arms to tag them for experiments. By the time Hungary went to the camps, they didn't bother because you weren't going to live long enough to do tests and survive. So my mother and grandmother never had numbers.
Wow, that's interesting.
Because they were just killing people so quickly. There was just no point.
Right. Yeah, I didn't know that about Hungary. I'm glad you filled that part in.
And then another interesting thing that I was reading in there is, Ernie, why don't you explain? Well, we'll let Steve explain what a capo was.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, what?
A capo, K-A-P-O.
A barrack scarf.
Or Ernie.
Well, the often Jewish guards that the Nazis got a hold of and I guess brainwashed to try and do their dirty work for them, so that Jewish guards would be guarding Jewish prisoners.
And they were called capos.
Yeah, I mean, I think in Poland they were called the Blue Police, if I'm not mistaken.
Interesting. Well,
Yes, they can be quite cruel as well.
I had a question for you, Steve. I want you to tell the viewers a little bit about some of the little strategies and methods that your mother made that probably saved their life.
Right. So,
of course, she was fluent in how many languages?
She spoke at that point 7 fluent languages.
Hmm.
And I remember asking my mother, "Why in the world do you speak all these languages?" She goes, "No one's going to learn Hungarian." So we all have to learn other languages. She's very funny as well. So one of the things that she did, because it was something that they always enjoyed doing together in Hungary, was making fake meals. Because in the camps, essentially, they were being starved.
Mm-hmm.
And so they would go through the process of cutting up foods, preparing the food, cooking the food, eating the food. just emulating what it should look like if they weren't being starved to death in a death camp. And part of my mother's struggle, remember she was 17 years old, was trying to keep my grandmother's spirits up, because you really had to want to live, and it was very easy to give up. Because basically everyone in the camps had typhus. Everyone was very ill. Everyone was emaciated, dead or dying. And it was very easy to give up. I mean, how many times, Gary, have we been down 5-1 in the third and given up?
Well, not only that, Steve, but there's one thing that Ernie mentioned to me also is that, and maybe you can talk just a little bit about this, is that why was the reason why women died more than men at the concentration camps?
Well, that was one of the things brought out by our guide at Auschwitz, that women actually died at a faster rate than men. And apparently the reason why was that they were crowded into smaller quarters, barracks, which is not to say that the men were living in luxury or something.
No, that was not luxury.
But under that sort of, concentration of population in close quarters, smaller barracks, disease spread more rapidly. There may have been other reasons why that women, to begin with, were more susceptible to disease than men. But in a way, you could kind of compare that notion to what happened with COVID, the really concentrated parts of any country in the United States. The disease spread more rapidly. There are always other factors, but
I would add one thing to that, Ernie. If you always keep in mind that the only reason people were really kept alive was to do hard labor, many women and children were killed because they didn't want to waste what little food there was on them. And so my mother, who was 17 when she went to Auschwitz, and she's 97 now. This is why there were only something like 250,000 survivors left. Because most of the children were killed because there was no reason to keep them alive. They served no purpose. Very cruel.
Yeah, well, actually, that caused a mind link to come into being in my mind when you mentioned the children, because I have to confess that when I first stepped into the camp, I had what I guess you would call sort of a naive idea that I would just feel the evil radiating from every object in there, from every brick, from every guard tower, from every trench or whatever. And initially that wasn't the way it was. Somehow it was when I got to the train platform that it really hit me, kind of all of a sudden, that here were mothers being ripped away from their children, just torn away, families seeing each other for the last time, the cattle cars. It just, somehow that seemed to me more real than anything else. It's almost as if you could hear the screams. It's just a personal experience I had.
Yeah. So, Steve, I think before I interrupted you, you were talking about some of the ways that they did cope, like preparing the fake meals. And I asked you about your mother speaking, being fluent in so many languages. Obviously, she was highly intelligent, but of course, her mother was in danger probably because of her age, right, as well?
Right. So my grandmother had two problems for survival. One was that mentally she was devastated by the loss of her beloved husband. And two, she was very small. She was 4'11". She was very frail. She couldn't do hard labor. And so my mother did the work of two.
Wow.
And she made sure she was the hardest worker, and she risked her own life by protecting her mother with the guards. Because the guards would see my grandmother not doing very much, and they would hit her. And then one day, my mother, forgot where she was for a moment and said, "You hit my mother again, and I'm not going to work." Part of the mental cruelty was that it separated families. So they didn't realize that they were mother and daughter. But because my mother was such a hard worker, they basically left my grandmother alone.
And your mother also forged relationships with the guard, one in particular. Is that correct?
Right. So I believe that was in Bergen-Belsen, not Auschwitz. But she did develop a cordial relationship. My grandmother was very handy with knitting and cooking and things, so they used to give her those sorts of quote unquote easy jobs. And he took care of her, and as we say, put her in a position to be successful, and really got her out of harm's way, because otherwise she would not have survived.
I remember one little incident where I think this was in BB, where your mom got a beet, and they were going to eat the beet, and then your mom decided that you could only have one bite out of the beet each because they had to save it, and she put it back in her clothes, and then they found the beet and took it away. And it was kind of humorous when her mother said, "We should have eaten that whole beet like I wanted to the first time." But man,
I'll take a guess, and it's a very funny story in 2024. But I suspect in 1945, it wasn't too funny to them. Fortunately, we can't begin to imagine what it was like. Again, we talk about taking things for granted. Well, when you're being starved, a beet, it's a tiny vegetable, is a big deal. And you're not used to be able to walk into a supermarket store or whatever you want. You're basically eating this garbage that they're feeding you. It's just incredible how anyone survived it. And my mother and grandparents lived apparently a nice middle to upper middle class life in Hungary. And to go from that to what they went to, it's amazing that anyone was able to survive. You never know when it's going to end. So how do you stay positive every day? So that to me is the skill set that makes my mother fight to survive today, that made her fight to live her life after my father died of a heart attack 35 years ago, that gave her the fight and the courage and the discipline to work in nursing homes until she was 85, full time.
She's got that fighting spirit, knows how to survive.
You think I've been a better tennis player with that?
Well, you weren't bad, old chum. You weren't bad.
Obviously, it skipped a generation, but oh well, maybe next time.
Well, there was another encounter your mother had in the book with someone that stuck in my mind as well, and kind of links up with something I read a while back. But there was an SS man who apparently she started speaking to him, he to her, and he went and got her a drink. It was, I don't know, maybe a sweet drink, sort of like the equivalent of a cola or whatever, and apparently took a shine to her, and later on told another officer there, I assume to also be in the SS, to make sure that she got a nice, pretty dress and shoes. And I think that was the last time that she saw this SS officer at all. And what occurred to me was there was a pretty famous play written in Germany in the 20th century called Of the Devil's General, and it was after the Second World War. And this one general in there who seemed to be less anti-Semitic than his co-officers made the remark, well, you know, we all had our own Jew, meaning we, particularly in that period when your mom was herded into the camp with her mother, the Germans had to start thinking about, well, what if we lose? We need some sort of alibi in the form of a Jew to, when we're taken to trial or whatever, we'll be able to say, well, I helped this person, blah, blah, blah. Now, I'm not saying, I have no evidence that that was exactly what the guy was after in that encounter with your mother. I'm just saying that it did cross my mind, you know.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's no question that as the Allies were marching through Europe and the Nazis were fleeing, that there was a very determined effort to cover what they had done. And, you know, the sad part, again, not a happy story as you're describing, is at Bergen-Belsen, they were killing as many people as they could before they left the camp. And, you know, again, the same notion that, you know, no body, no evidence.
So, okay. So right before they were liberated, you're saying, which was April 15th, 1945, right?
Yeah. So if I may, would you like me to speak about my mother's experience post-liberation?
Absolutely. I'm gonna just read the first part of this. A tank entered the camp and a Yiddish-speaking British soldier drove all around the camp. He announced through a megaphone that the British army had liberated us and we were free. He assured us that no one would harm us anymore. We cried and laughed, but we did not quite believe what he was telling us. We were running around the camp looking for our family, but unfortunately we could not find any. We did find some friends who at first did not recognize because they looked so old, thin, and ill. The day after the liberation, the same Yiddish-speaking British soldier rode around the camp again looking for interpreters, people who spoke languages and were able to communicate with all the people that came from all over Europe. I volunteered even though I did not speak Yiddish, but spoke perfect German and was able to understand Yiddish-speaking people and make myself understood by them. Go ahead, Steve.
Right. So there's actually also an interesting follow-up to this. So the British came, they couldn't believe what they were witness to. And anytime you read the testimony of servicemen liberated these camps, the shock and horror of what they found is indescribable. Again, you know, we can't forget this history. So my mother volunteered to be a translator primarily because my grandmother was down to about 60 pounds.
Wow.
She was extremely ill. Both my mother and grandmother had typhus, and she desperately wanted to get my mother medical care and thought that if she could help out, that would in fact happen, which it did. So they then wanted to utilize my mother's language skills. So they asked her if she would be willing to go into jail cells with women Nazi prison guards and try to get them to confess to what they had done. And she did that as well successfully.
Interesting. Right into the jail cells.
So then they got her a job to work for the Jewish Welfare Board in, of all places, Frankfurt, Germany. And so she and my mother packed up what little they had and went to Frankfurt, Germany. I remember saying to her, at the liberation, you went to Germany? You're joking. And she said, where were we going to go? They killed my father. They took our home. They took his business. We had no friends, no relatives, no nothing. And that's where the job was, so that's where we went.
Yeah. Huh.
So, you if you read the book, she talks about the head of the Jewish Welfare Board who became a surrogate father to her. And after she worked there for a period of time, he said, "So Lily, before the Nazis dragged you out of your home, what were your dreams and aspirations?" And she said, "I always wanted to be a doctor." And again, backing up a little bit, all the Hungarian Jews were kicked out of the public schools, and they went into a Jewish school with about 200 students, and it was an incredibly brilliant group of students and teachers. And so back to Frankfurt, he arranged for her to take an entrance exam in German to enroll in the University of Frankfurt Medical School 6-year program. And she said, I never finished 11th grade. I never finished high school. He said, "Doesn't matter." So my mother takes this test. I believe she gets the highest mark in the class. And they give her a full scholarship to go to medical school. And she finishes 2 years of medical school. And then she meets a guy. And so can I talk a little bit about my dad's experience in the war?
Yeah, you can. Let me just interject for a second that when they were back in Hungary and when Transylvania was annexed, the parliament passed a law in, I think, 1920 maybe, that they thought things were going to be hunky-dory, and then all of a sudden only 3% of Jewish people could go to university. So that was probably one of the reasons that she couldn't go to university there, but they were already starting to tighten the screws. Go ahead and let's talk about Walter a little bit.
Okay, so my father was from Vienna, Austria. My grandfather, his father, was a highly accomplished physician, one of the most highly regarded in all of Europe. And he was a doctor in the true sense of the word, in the sense that he used to take care of shoemakers who paid him in shoelaces, farmers who paid him in chickens, and royalty in Europe. He just absolutely did not care about money. Business person of the family was my grandmother, who ran the largest sanitarium in Vienna. And that's where they lived, because my grandfather didn't make a lot of money. He just loved being a doctor. And the sanitarium happened to have a tennis court, which is where my father learned to play tennis, even though soccer was his first love. So in 1939, when the Nazis entered Austria, they rounded up all the prominent Jews in Vienna. And my grandfather, while not wealthy, was very prominent. And they sent the police to his home. They drag him out of his house, tell my father and grandmother, my father was also an only child, that they have 24 hours to get out of Vienna. So they had heard that this was coming, and they had a plan. And so they take my grandfather down to the police station, where the police chief is interrogating the quote-unquote prisoners. And as fate would have it, the police chief had a very sick child who was near death, who my grandfather saved. So he saw my grandfather and obviously recognized him. And there were two lines. There was the line to the concentration camps, and there was a line to God knows where. And my grandfather was on the line to the concentration camps, and he walks up to my grandfather, and he goes, "You stupid Jew, you're on the wrong line," and he slaps him. And he takes him and he puts him in his office. And so one of my grandfather's patients was King Peter of Yugoslavia. And so the police chief arranges to the king of Yugoslavia to get my grandfather a visa, and he manages to sneak him out of Austria.
Wow. Interesting.
Yeah.
So the family went to the south of France, and then ultimately settled in London, where my grandmother actually died in 1947, natural causes. But the relevance of that is, as the Nazis were now making their march through Europe, my father was a 5'7", 185-pound German-speaking ball of muscle, and he got deported. Because it was very similar to what Americans did with Japanese folks after Pearl Harbor. People just panicked because you couldn't tell the good guys from the bad guys. So just like the Japanese internment camps, the Brits expelled all the German-speaking people, and they sent my father to Australia. And he's on this horrible boat where everyone was sick. It's a 3-week trip. They get there, and there were probably 1,000 people on this trip. And when they get there, they pull out 3 or 4 names. My dad was one of them. You're on the wrong boat. Get back in the boat. And they ship him to India.
Wow.
He lives in India for 6 months, playing soccer, giving dance lessons, do whatever he can to make money. While he works his way back to London, finds his way to the United States, and joins the United States Army. At that time, there was a secret group within the Army trained at Camp Ritchie in Maryland called the Ritchie Boys. The Ritchie Boys were 2,000 German-speaking Jewish men and women who were trained at Camp Ritchie and then sent back to Germany as spies, counterintelligence agents, and interrogators. And so my father, because he spoke fluent German, of course, became a Ritchie boy and was sent to Germany. You know, his claim to fame being Axis Sally, the propaganda queen. He was in on her capture, so that was a
Really?
good thing, because obviously, you know, Ernie talked about Goebbels and the propaganda. You know, we see it with Hamas in the Middle East today. Propaganda is a very powerful tool.
Absolutely.
And they sort of make up the numbers to make their cases. So propaganda is a very, very dangerous element that bad actors use to get, in theory, college-educated people to support a terrorist group. So we can't let our guard down. You know, it's a very big weapon. So my father is sent to Germany. The war ends, and they sent him to Frankfurt and place him in charge of displaced persons in Frankfurt after the war. And lo and behold, there's this Hungarian mother-daughter who were displaced living in DP camp in Frankfurt. And my father meets my grandmother. And my grandmother is 4'11", sweet as sugar. And my father's interrogating her, and they absolutely fall in love with each other. And they're holding hands after 5 minutes. And my grandmother says, Waltershire, have I got a girl for you? That's what happens.
That's a neat story. So your mother
Excellent.
actually was responsible for your mother and dad, your grandmother, for your mother and dad. How about that?
So they meet during my mother's second year of medical school, fall in love, and they become the first Jewish wedding in Frankfurt after the war.
Wow.
But now there was a dilemma. After she finished her second year, my father's hitch was up, and they wanted him to remain in Germany. And my parents decided that they didn't want to raise a family in Eastern Europe, and they wanted to move to the United States where the streets were paved in gold. So unfortunately, my mother dropped out of medical school after 2 years, and obviously there was no applicability between medical school there and here, because she never finished high school. She never went to college. So they came here in 1947, settled in Queens. Both got multiple jobs to pay the bills, and built a life here. So very relevant, both of their stories. And there's one other side note, if I may, which is really as we've all become attuned and enjoying both the good and the bad of social media, although obviously the bad we don't enjoy very much. So, going back to Bergen-Belsen for a moment, when the British liberated the camp, a group of fourth-year medical students from Belgium volunteered to go with the British Army and try to save and help whoever survived. And so, when my mother agreed to be a translator, as you had mentioned before, she got paired with a particular young man. They're all, in their mid-20s. They're young people.
Mm-hmm.
And they did their thing, and they saved who they could save. And obviously, many people died even after liberation, which is truly a tragedy. And so that was that. There was no contact after that. About 10 years ago, at a restaurant with my wife Meryl and my mother, when I get a Facebook message from a girl who says, my grandfather was a doctor from Belgium who volunteered with the British forces, and your mother's memoir mentions a Belgian doctor that she worked with after the liberation. Perhaps she knew him. He died 10 years ago, and he would never talk about the atrocities he witnessed in the camps.
Mm-hmm.
And a little bit later, I get another Facebook message from that young woman's father saying, my father was a doctor, and obviously it was father-daughter, and they sent me pictures of him and a video that they put on Facebook every year. They're not a Jewish family, by the way, for all the Holocaust deniers out there, and obviously, there are more and more of them as the survivors die. And I show my mother the pictures, and she goes, oh my God, I was his interpreter. So
Really?
It was him, which led to a series of events where they came to visit my mother in New York on her 91st birthday, which was 6 years ago. And we have very much stayed in touch. We've now met both children of this doctor. We met the grandchild of the doctor. And we're hopefully next year, Meryl and I want to go to the French Open. We plan to visit them in Belgium because it's a 1-hour train ride from Paris.
Fantastic. What a story. What a coincidence.
So that's the good part of social
Certainly
media.
is.
Yeah.
The revisionist history part of it, I'm not such a fan of, as you can imagine. But, I thank Mark Zuckerberg for that.
Well, Steve, I think we're going to wind it up here. And what I'm going to do here again is show the book. And the month was May. Lillian Berliner, and there's a picture of her with her mother and father. Steve, is this book still able to be gotten on Amazon or bought?
Yes.
So, okay. So it's and the month was May, Lillian, a memoir by Lillian Berliner. Steve, thanks for joining us. Ernie, do you have any other questions for Steve while we're here on this topic?
Yeah, just briefly, Steve. Well, first of all, I mean, your mind boggles at the strength of a human being to survive what your mother went through. As I said, at the time when the possibility of staying alive was narrower than ever. But I also wonder, in terms of her desire to write the book, I think that takes probably as much strength to write about such horrible experiences that I would think, most people, by and large, would try to put out of their mind as quickly as possible, to the degree that it's possible, but was she ready to take that up, or did it take some nudging and some silent time by herself before she was able to do that? Because I'm just thinking, wow, how could you lay all of that out?
It's a great question. So, like everything else in my life that's good, as Gary will be the first to agree with, is it all starts with my wife, Meryl. And so my wife and my mother has been a love fest for 45 years.
Uh,
And literally, my wife is the daughter that my mother never had, but always wanted.
mhm.
And so this was never meant to be a book.
Mhm.
Merrill really felt it was important for future generations to understand the journey that my family survived. And so it really started out as really a very simple, please tell us what you know about your life, Dad's life, grandparents. And so ironically, where this changed was, I guess it's 15 or 18 years ago, we took our kids to the city, just to have a little bit of a play date. And I took my son to my squash club. And we were just sort of playing around. And it was Sunday night around dinner time. There was only one other person at the club who was a friend of ours, who was also a Maccabi squash player and was a professor at Yale University. And we got to Israel with him in 1993. And so we were just chatting, and he said his wife is in Sweden. He's by himself. I said, oh, why don't you guys come to dinner with us? So we go to dinner, and lo and behold, his family is from the same part of Hungary as my mother. And he was just shocked at her story. He basically said, this is a story that needs to be heard.
Needs to be told.
And he took his writing assistant and said, your job is to get this book published. And even though Merrill did most of the typing and most of the hard work, Lily would handwrite it, Merrill would type it. Ted Barber's assistant would actually type it up, and they were the ones who got it published. So Ernie was just a series of coincidences. It was really never intended to be a memoir, but what's happened is she has become such a role model for anyone who's ever met her. And I can't tell you how many people, through business, through friends, through sports, have had their children reading her book, talking about it during their bar mitzvahs, all the high schools and colleges and synagogues that she's lectured at. And my daughter continues to lecture at, and I occasionally lecture high schools on it. My son is going to start lecturing on it. This is a story that needs to be told. And yet, my mother would be the first one to tell her. She goes, look, there's nothing special about me. There are a million stories just like mine. But the reality is every story is different.
Oh, it's such a compelling account, yes.
But again, she tried to water down much of the ugliness because she didn't want it to be something that people couldn't read. She softened a lot of the stories, a lot of the interaction among family members, but it became a real source of pride for her because, when my daughter was a student at Lehigh University taking a history class, studying the Holocaust, she had my mother lecture her history class at her college.
Interesting.
I mean, it just doesn't get better than that.
No, it doesn't. And you've got such a love for your family, and it's so tight knit. And I do know Meryl, and she is a sweetheart, Ernie. You'll have to meet her one day. And she put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into writing that, a lot of work. And it's great that the family got together and did it. It sounds like there was a little nudging, and actually sounds like that your mother was happy to give accounts of what happened along the way. Steve, we sure appreciate you. And again, I'm going to show this book one more time. And the month was May, of memoir, Lillian Berliner. And we're not necessarily on here to try to sell books, but if you ever do want to buy a book, this would be a great one to get. And you said it's available on Amazon, and it's about a 95-page book. It's not a long book, but it's very powerful. And so
it's a 3-4 hour read.
Yeah. Or for Ernie, or in Ernie's case, maybe a 1 hour. Because
You flatter me, brother.
Yes.
Thank you. Keep it up.
Okay, I will. Steve, thanks for
Steve.
joining us, and we're going to bump off here, but it's been great. Another episode of the Gary Plock Tennis Show with Ernie.
Wonderful meeting you, Steve, and
You as well.
we'll continue it.
These are two fellows that both have big forehands. Although Ernie's is like old Medvedev's, and Steve's is a little more like the Joker or Rafa, somewhere in between.
Well, yes, mine is Division II NCAA, and Steve is certainly one.
He's
So,
Division I. And you don't want him on a squash court, Ernie. I'll tell you that right now. Steve, thanks for joining us.
Okay.
We look forward to seeing you down. Steve's over in Boca Raton and up in New York City, both. And he's been a long time working and living in New York, and is known around there as one of the very top squash players in the area. And he's a tennis man too. He can go both ways. So, Steve, thanks
Excellent.
again for joining us, and hope to see you and talk to you again.
Have a good night, Steve.
Thanks so much.
Okay,
Thanks for your time. Have a great day, guys.
you too.